This concept of the revanchist imperialist is at the very heart of the book Atlas des guerres à venir that I wrote, and which applies, as we shall see, to Vladimir Putin's Russia and to Vladimir Putin's characters. I think it's the ideal concept to enter a little into my intellectual universe, because at the same time it's all about one person who is this vindictive imperialist, and I'll give you a list and I'll explain what it's all about. And at the same time, what you have to realize is that this personality is only one, that the realization, so to speak, of an event determined by a whole host of forces, and these are historical forces that come from much further back and which concern a certain political community. So what do I call a vengeful imperialist? To give you a list of characters that stand out. In this category you've got Napoleon, you've got Hitler, you've got Stalin, you've got Vladimir Putin. I'll come back to that later, but you've also got other characters like Oliver Cromwell in the 17th century. You have Pisistratus, the Athenian tyrant of the 6th century BC. You have Lysander, the Spartan leader of the Peloponnesian Wars. So I'm not going to give you the whole story, of course, that's not the idea. What I want is to make you understand exactly what I call a revanchist or revolutionary imperialist. It's a character who's part of a long historical trajectory lasting about a century, a little less, rarely more. Generally speaking, it's around 70 years. You take a political community of a certain size, you don't see them appearing everywhere, the revanchist imperialists. It's an individual who, after a very severe national humiliation which has consequences, extremely deep-rooted political issues, which, by the way, systematically give rise to revolution, which is why I also call them revolutionary imperialists. I'm changing the term from revenge imperialist to revolutionary, because revolutionary ideology isn't always the one most supported by the character in question. That's why there are both terms. Maybe it'll be clearer when I talk about it. And so this character will be led to take power in his country and carry a kind of momentum that will take the country beyond its borders for a while. And in particular, what's important to understand is that he's a character who, at a certain point, embodies a certain mentality for a nation. Let's take a very simple example. What is the long trajectory? Basically, you have a nation that is not yet a democracy. Generally speaking, it's a nation at the stage just before parliamentary democracy, which is the regime I'll call the sovereign monarchy. This term doesn't necessarily mean king, as it can be quite broad. Simply put, it's a regime in which power is centralized and not vested in an assembly. A regime with very strong authority, where there is very little freedom of expression or freedom of the press. In other words, it's a regime that is, we might say, authoritarian monarchy, an autocracy if you prefer another term, which works quite well. And this regime comes at a time when it is, let's say, the heir of a great national victory which established the country as a power, a great power. So in this register you have the excuse. Guillaume tells me that I'm having a little fan trouble, so I'm going to move my microphone so that you can hear me properly. He'll tell me if it works. As an example, if you like, you have the wars of Louis XIV, which enabled France to grow very strongly, which is why he was called Louis le Grand, but which isolated the country on the international scene, because in the end the country was a great power but isolated, but its territory had grown considerably. You have the Bismarckian German Empire, which was also formed following a series of wars, each of which lasted about 20 years, and which therefore became very powerful, and entered the concert of great powers as the German Empire, whereas before there was no German unity. You have the Empire of the Tsars, which reached the apogee of its power at the end of the 19th century, following a series of wars, notably against the Ottoman Empire, and often allied with Western powers, notably England and France. The Ottoman Empire was allied with England and France and against Russia, so here too the struggle was relatively against all the other powers of the time. I won't go into the other examples I've given, but I think these, which are the most recent, are the ones that best illustrate the scheme I'm talking about. So you have this autocracy, which is very strongly legitimized by the people, by this construction of national narratives, by this glory that helped establish a unified and powerful political regime. And this regime will go following a crisis, usually a military crisis, which will constitute a humiliation. And do away with the legitimacy on which autocracy relied. For Louis XIV's France, it was the 7 Years' War, which was lost quite miserably, which caused France to lose almost all its colonies in India and America, and above all humiliated it militarily, particularly at the Battle of Rosbach, lost to the Prussians. To give you an idea of the humiliating nature of this defeat, 60 years later, almost 60 years later, when Napoleon defeated the Prussians at Jena, he tore down the column commemorating the victory at Rosbach to the glory of the Prussian army. So we're dealing with the same kind of event, but also the same kind of psychological spring of the signing of the Civil Army of 1940, wanted by Hitler in the same carriage as the one that consecrated the German defeat in 1918. You see, it's that kind of, in fact, it's the same movement. If you look at the defeat of the German Empire in the Great War, it's its military humiliation. The same thing happened at the same time with the Tsarist Empire. It's also a military collapse that causes the collapse of the regime, the loss of confidence in the regime. And if you take every time, it happens some 40 years after the regime's collapse, after its, in any case, this event that discredits the regime happens some 40 years after its establishment. You see, the end of Louis XIV's reign, 1715, the defeat, the beginning of the war of 1715, that's 1756. I'm no longer sure that the defeat at Rosbach was in 1756. I think it was 1757, but that's a detail. The establishment of the German Empire is 1870. The defeat, the humiliating war, began in 1914, 44 years. The last great Russian victory which consolidated the Russian Empire was at 1878 in the Russo-Turkish War, and so again 1917 we're on the same time scale. So the big difference between these cases is that for the Russian and German revolutions it happened immediately. In the case of the French Revolution, the 7 Years' War ended in 1763. So it all comes down to the fact that there's a second element that causes the regime to collapse. It's not enough for it to be humiliated, that's its loss of legitimacy. It also has to be ruined, and so the system in fact no longer works, and riots ensue, of hunger in particular, and that this causes economic forces to abandon the stability of the regime, believing that they will find greater fulfillment even through a period of instability than by maintaining the same regime. So for Germany and Russia during the Great War, this happened immediately, as both countries were ruined by war and the population was starving. For France it took a little longer, because we came out of the 7 Year War with a huge debt. But this huge debt only really took its toll after other wars, notably the American War of Independence, brought the monarchy to the brink of bankruptcy in 1889, and a food shortage in the summer of 1889 led to riots. So you have a regime that is both discredited, an autocratic regime that is both discredited and which is ruined, facing a very serious economic crisis. That's going to get the public riled up, something that delegitimization and wounded pride are often not enough to do. From there you have a regime collapse. I'm not going to go into the details of how revolutions are made. They always happen in the same way, which is the subject of my book, The Structure of History. They all follow the same sequence. If you look at the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, it's the same thing. The German Revolution is also the same thing. All these revolutions, what I call national revolutions, which are distinct from other revolutions that I would call independentist, in which we can classify the United States, ancient Rome, this kind of country, the United Provinces in the 16th century. That's another problem. As far as national revolutions are concerned, it's always like that. With national revolutions in particular, you have an economic collapse of the country that continues through the revolution, because revolutionary instability initially worsens the economic crisis, has a tendency to destroy all institutions, and so you find yourself in a country which is not otherwise devoid of institutions, but which leaves plenty of room for the construction of alternative institutions. And that's where you're in a situation of chaos and a situation where institutions need to be renewed, that you have a personality emerging, which is the imperialist, revenger, or revolutionary. I call him a revolutionary because he usually carries the ideas of the revolution in progress, and that's what brings him to power. And I call him a revenger because he's someone who embodies a thirst for revenge of the nation after the humiliation that brought down the previous regime. That's why I call it that. And this imperialist avenger mobilizes all forces. We're talking every time about a nation that's powerful, that's resilient, that has a population that's very capable, that's educated, that's trained, that's militarily capable, you name it. And that's why there's this particular crisis of pride, because the country feels it's being led by people who don't allow it to exploit its potential, and who in fact cause its humiliation through their incompetence. And the imperialist revenge, it's supported by the fact that, quite simply, he wants to respond to this pride. He wants to take the country to the top. That's why, in general, imperialist revengers are nationalists. So it's the case with Napoleon, it's the case with Hitler, it's also the case with Stalin. This leads them to engage their countries in a whole host of conflicts, spilling over their borders and gradually arousing the concern and anger of neighboring countries, because they destabilize the international order too much. They're scary, and they threaten a certain number of established interests within the international community. So it's at this point that you gradually have, after it could be several phases of war. There are more, we'll say, in the Napoleonic Wars before the General War than against Hitler's Germany. Hitler's Germany went very, very fast, but this coalition is bound to defeat the imperialist avenger, because he may be the head of a powerful country, but he's still just one country. So this is mechanically impossible for him to win, if you like. One exception to this in the list I've given you is Stalin. Why is that? Because with Stalin we're dealing with a special case. He arrived at the same time as our imperialist revenge neighbor Hitler, and that it was Hitler who attacked first, and that as a result Stalin found himself on the side of Hitler, of those who defended themselves. And there was what was called the Great Patriotic War, the war on the Eastern Front, what the Russians call the Great Patriotic War, which in fact, in Russia, of what wars are normally at the origin of an autocracy, that is, wars of re-legitimization, the great national threat, the coalition, the great danger against oneself, from which one manages to emerge victorious, even with great sacrifices. This was less true of the Germany of 1970, where the British Margain had been relatively successful. It was truer, for example, of the France of Louis XIV, where the War of the Spanish Succession had been very difficult. But it was also true of the Russo-Turkish War at the end of the 19th century. And so this is also the aspect of the Great Patriotic War in Russia, which legitimizes a regime that would otherwise have been, if you reverse it, if Stalin had attacked first, the USSR would probably have been defeated by a European coalition for fear of communism, and it's very likely that Hitler would have been on the winning side with a kind of Nazi USSR. And that's not history fiction I'm making. I'm not saying gratuitous things. It's what emerges from the mechanics of things. Truly, I don't have the time to go into detail. It's not interesting here anyway. What is interesting is that you've understood what a vindictive imperialist is. And I'll tell you why, in my opinion, Putin is the man. Quite simply because you have a powerful autocratic regime that has reconstituted itself in 1945, legitimized by this great patriotic war, which also lasted some 40 years, is the Soviet regime, and collapsed, is all. Autocratic regimes, after a crisis that ended in the 1980s, a military humiliation in Afghanistan, an even greater humiliation with the Chernobyl crisis, and the ruin of the country, since it was no longer able to keep up with the American arms race with Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, that caused the collapse. If you look at the sequence of events in 1991, you're looking at a genuine new national revolution. More or less the same things are happening in the same order as in 1917. The funny thing is, you could call it a capitalist revolution since there was a lot of privatization, but it had the same economic effects as the Bolshevik revolution. It's quite interesting, but I'm not going to dwell on it. Perhaps we'll come back to that another day. And in the midst of all this chaos, what is emerging? The figure of Vladimir Putin, who is going to try to restore power to his country, of the Russian Empire, and is going to do so in the same way as all imperialists do. That is, in the same way as all imperialists do. That's to say, firstly, that his country's borders are smaller than they used to be. Let me show you a small map. Unfortunately, I can't show it to you on the internet, but I'll show it to you on... It's actually taken from my Wars to Come, so you can see what they're like. So that you can see... What does the loss of territory correspond to? Because I'm not sure everyone has it in mind. What you have to realize is that in Europe today, the fall of the USSR was a true nationalist catastrophe for Russia. Population loss was of the order of half of the inhabitants who were dominated, since the USSR plus the Warsaw Pact accounted for around 400 million inhabitants, 393 million from memory. So they lost the Warsaw Pact and they lost most of the Russian Empire. I'll try to show you like this. I hope you can see it. At the very top you'll see a map showing red is the national territory and orange shows the loss of French territory. You see something on the Indian coast and you see the possessions in North America. Below, I'm afraid you can't see Germany. But in any case, the loss of territory has been known to happen, but we mustn't forget that they also lost their colonial empire in 1918. And as for the Russian Empire, you can see that they lost the entire Warsaw Pact, the whole of Central Asia, and also the whole of Europe. What the client countries in Africa were, and which are generally included in the Soviet Empire, if you're looking for a map of the Soviet Empire, it will be quite visible. So what Vladimir Putin has been doing for the last 2012 years, especially since he didn't have the means to do it before, is that he has first of all restored his country's economic and military power. It's still not brilliant economically, but we'll talk about that later. But above all, in economic terms, he benefited from the hand of oil. And since 2012, he has been striving to reconstitute Russian ascendancy, if not Russian possession, over the immediate area, and in particular those territories considered to be Russian territories, that is the Ukraine and the whole of Belarus and the Baltic states.